Hello BookTube. Welcome back to my channel. Today we have the next entry in the Ideal Bookshelf series. This is one that I've been wanting to get around to for a while, and it was sped up in part by Elle from Elle Thinks, who has a fantastic channel. You should definitely check her out if you haven't already. But I made a comment on one of her videos where she hesitantly said that maybe in 2022 she might consider picking up Wheel of Time. And I made a comment that there are other series that I might point to first as good fantasy series to read, and she asked for recommendations because she's fairly new to fantasy, having read only a handful of them, and wanted to know where to go next. So that got me to speed up my thoughts on what would be on this Ideal Bookshelf. So if you are new here, if you've missed the previous Ideal Bookshelves, what this is considering is if you have just one bookshelf to fill, or if you are only picking up books. This is probably the better way to consider it. If you're only picking up books to go on your shelf that you want as permanent books, ones that you want to read and reread endlessly going forward. So not the one and dones, not the, well, this might be fun to try out because it's only a quarter. None of those kinds of books. But if you are intentionally crafting and cultivating a collection with the intention of a lifelong enjoyment of what you have on your shelf, what would you buy? And so, like the science fiction one, I've got 10 series here because fantasy is done in series. All of these I've read something out of. Some of them I've read just a few books out of. Others I've read all of them. I'm going to talk just briefly because this could go really, really long. But I'm going to talk about these 10 series and some brief thoughts on why each one makes this list. And then I'll be making a companion video that will hopefully be up Sunday, where I talk about a couple of series that I have not read that I would like to get to that may or may not end up being in the running to make this cut. There are a lot of fantasy series I have not read. There are plenty of ones that I have read partially or in full. There are ones like Wheel of Time that I've read in its entirety. I'm very glad that I've read it, but I don't foresee ever rereading it. Would I potentially pick up a book or two along the way to revisit that book? Maybe. But I don't know that I would ever sit down and reread that entire 14-book series. There are long moments where there's just not enough payoff, I think, to go through it all again, no matter how much I might enjoy some aspects of it. I will caveat it that I've watched the Wheel of Time series that we finished last night with the 8th episode, and I did mostly enjoy what they did with that. There are some changes that are questionable. There are a lot of things that are left out that it's painful to see them getting left out. But yeah, let's just dive right in before I get too far. And then I will preface this by saying if a title has appeared on a previous Ideal Bookshelf list, it is not going to reappear here. And so that's why you will not hear The Lord of the Rings, Hobbit, The Silmarillion on this list. They've already appeared as a part of the Ideal Bookshelf. So they would absolutely make this cut, first and foremost. They would be the number one always. Always, always, always. So here are 10 non-Tolkien fantasy series. So we will start first with Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. This is Considering Era 1 Mistborn, I could see it as being Era 2 as well. I really enjoy Era 2. Era 1 is by far the better crafted and the better storytelling. Era 2 has a very different feel to it. It's more lighthearted. It's very different scene, but still really, really enjoyable. But this in particular, when considering it, was Era 1 Mistborn. I gave consideration briefly to putting just the entire Cosmere, but that could get wildly out of control quickly. If you don't know, the Cosmere is the term that for Brandon Sanderson. He has a whole bunch of works that are all somehow connected. And so slowly layers of that have been revealed. And it's interesting to see, but there are certainly books along the way that I don't know that I would reread. Elantris coming to mind first and foremost. I am glad I read Elantris, but I don't know that I would ever go back and reread that one. Whereas Mistborn, whether it's Era 1 or Era 2, I would happily reread. I have reread Era 1 and will probably reread Era 2, given that the final book, I think, is supposed to come out in 2022. So it's got just wonderful creation of the allomancy, the magic system, and that is the star of this series, is the magic system and how it's used across both of the eras in very interesting and creative ways. On top of all of the characters and the storytelling, which are great as well. But it really is the magic system that is the first draw for this series and what I enjoy about going back to it. And so the obvious next one, I said I wasn't going to include the entire Cosmere, but there is another series out of the Cosmere that I would put onto this list, and this is the Wheel of Time but Better Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. This is the big one that he's working on, a new book every couple of years. He's got 4 out of 10 that he's planning, and each set of 5 is supposed to be a complete kind of arc. So I'm looking forward to, in the next couple of years, finally getting book 5 out. And unlike George R.R. Martin, I have confidence that as long as Brandon Sanderson's alive, he will get around to finishing this series. And it's magnificent. It's long. It's got parts that are probably going to feel drawn out. There are definitely moments where you love and loathe the same characters across the entire arc. Most recently, one of my favorite characters in there is Kaladin. I think most people tend to like Kaladin, but he goes through a really dark and depressing arc in some of the more recent books, and it sucks seeing him in that funk. But it's great when he finally hits breakthroughs along the way, and it's just magnificent being along for this story. And it is a long series that I have no problem going back to. I've listened to them all exclusively audio, and so I'd like to pick up the physical books and actually read through them the next time I go back into them. But I find with these super long books, it's so much easier to juggle them by listening to them than it is to sit down and shut off everything else that you're going to read to get through them. So next, we'll do the Song of Ice and Fire series by George R.R. Martin. And I will leave it with a caveat here. I think the first 3 books in this are very rereadable and is something that I plan to reread at some point in time. Books 4 and 5, I'm not sure if I would reread them unless the next book finally comes out. And I'm not sure if another book ever will. It seems like he's doing everything he can to avoid finishing the next book. every time something else is announced that he's contributed to, it's frustrating. And I'm not even a super fan of the series, but I do enjoy the books, and I enjoy following the arcs of some of my favorite characters. Uh, the absolute favorite being Arya has been ever since the first few scenes in the very first book. So next, we'll do Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. And this is one that is not going to be to everybody's taste. It's got an older style of writing. It's got a very childlike approach to it because it is written more for children. It is, but it's got some great moments. It's got some fun characters along the way. Reepicheep and Puddleglum, two of my favorite, most memorable characters. And it's one that I always enjoy going back to C.S. Lewis. He is never going to surpass Tolkien in being a favorite author. But I find that every time I do read a C.S. Lewis book, I'm glad to have read it and I have enjoyed the process. And Narnia is one that I've read a couple different times and have enjoyed every time I've read it. And I expect that to only continue going forward. So next we'll do the Shannara series by Terry Brooks. And I think that this would just be a few of this series. I know he's got a lot of different series continuing the tales here. But I think his first trilogy and then the next one I think is a 4-book series. And I've read both of those and have enjoyed both of those tremendously. He gets much better after the first book, which is very, very much a lot like Eye of the World. Knockoff isn't the right word here, but it is, nor is copy, but it is an imitation almost of some of the sweeping majesty of Lord of the Rings, but not done nearly as well in either case. But it does have some good story arcs, and I'd be curious to continue some more of the Shannara series to see how much I would like it, and to consider expanding beyond those first couple series to see what else is out there. Terry Brooks is one of those writers that he's never one that comes to mind as a, oh my gosh, I've got to read everything by him, or one that I even prioritize reading something by, but I always do enjoy when I read it. I equate him one alongside with one of my favorite authors when I was growing up, David Eddings, who just narrowly missed this list. If I had an 11th spot, I'd probably put David Eddings into it, just because I really enjoyed the stories of Belgarath and the Sorcerer and all of those characters. And I imagine that if I went back and reread them today, I probably wouldn't enjoy it nearly as much as I did when I was young. But that's something that I probably should do at some point in time just to see, because I'd be curious if it holds up now to being a good series, or if it's mostly a nostalgic enjoyment. Which then leads us to the next one, the Old Kingdom series by Garth Nix. This is the Dark Horse fantasy series on this list. It's the unusual one. And this follows a really, really interesting magic system of sorts, where I don't even know how to describe it, but it involves being able to summon the dead and travel at times through the underworld type of area, and sealing off gates and keeping the dead at bay. And it is just a sweeping series that it stole my imagination as a child when I was younger. And I've reread it probably about 10 years ago and really enjoyed it. And then about a year or two, reread the first book again and really, really enjoyed it, but got sidetracked with other books that I hadn't read before, and so didn't get back around to refinishing the series. But it's one that I would like to get back on my shelf and give it a good reread again, and to pick up the books that have since come out to continue the series. When I last reread it, there were the 3 books in the trilogy and then 1 spin-off. And I think there are now 2 others that have come out. And so I'd love to revisit all 6 of those books. So I've got just a couple more here. So the Earthsea series by Ursula K. Le Guin would be next. And this is an interesting one. These are all relatively short, and I think there's 6 of them now. I know I've read the first 3 for sure, and really enjoyed them. And I believe that I would still enjoy the rest of them. This is my experience with Ursula K. Le Guin, and it is just wonderfully written. If you've read and enjoyed anything by Le Guin, you will not be disappointed in this one. Next, we have the Gentleman Bastard series by Scott Lynch. I don't think this one's a complete series yet. And book 1 in the series is by far my favorite still. And it starts with, it's a heist. It's a fantasy heist, and it is just so much fun. It's got some great characters. It's got some good wit and humor, and some really, really interesting dynamics along the way. And it's one that I've been wanting to get back to eventually. So maybe I'll look and see if there's a release date sometime for the next book in the series, if there is one coming, and give it a reread, slot it in sometime in 2023. So I've got 2 left to go. So I'm going to go to one that I read a ton and reread a ton in my teen years and into very early adulthood. And that is the Sword of Truth series by Terry Goodkind. For the longest time, Wizard's First Rule, being the first book in the series, was my favorite book of all time. This was before I fell in love with Tolkien. As soon as I fell for Tolkien, this one kind of fell to the wayside. I encountered Tolkien far later in life than I probably should have. But Sword of Truth, as a series, it's got some definite weak books along the way. And there are plenty of times where the author gets very, very preachy later in the series. But at the end of the day, it still tells a very, very interesting story with some great characters along the way. And one that I remember enjoying so much. If nothing else, the first 4 books in this series are a solid 4 books to read. After that, it slowly starts to go off the rails a little bit more. But I would definitely recommend those first 4 through Temple of the Winds as a great sample size for Terry Goodkind's writing. And I'm looking forward to, at some point in time, I think Leslie from the Nerdy Narrative wants to reread this series at some point in time. And I think I could probably convince Pax Panic, who absolutely loves the series, to read along on this one at some point in time too. So maybe that's something that we'll look to do at some point in time in the future, at least through the first 4 books in the series or something like that, and do just a revisit to a series that I absolutely loved during my formative years, and would gladly revisit at some point in time in the future. And so we have 1 left to go, and this is the big one. This is the long one. This is certainly the more recent I really have fallen for series, and that is the Realm of the Elderlings series by Robin Hobb. This is multiple series wrapped up into one overarching narrative. In my teen years, I read the Farseer trilogy with Fitz Chivalry and loved them. and revisited Assassin's Apprentice last year and enjoyed it and intended to continue that series, but have had issues getting my hands on the next books in that series. And then, of course, there's always other things to prioritize first. But then I started reading the Life Ship Traders this year, and oh my gosh, it solidified Hobb as one of my absolute favorite fantasy writers, potentially in the number 2 spot just behind Tolkien. We'll have to see if that continues going forward into the next sets of series in the realm of the Elderlings. But this is one I want to get really nice editions of each and every one of the books on my shelf and just work my way through the entire thing. Maybe wait a year or two and then just start Assassin's Apprentice and just go all the way through to the end of it in one big, long, epic year, which, of course, probably won't be 2022 because my 2022 is already kind of full with projects, and I'll have just finished Live Ship Traders definitely in January. And so I would want to reread them along the way and read everything in order. So maybe that'll be like a 2023 or 2024 kind of goal, is to just sit down and read all of the Realm of the Elderlings in order and just go through that entire series. And the bottom line with each and every one of these 10 series is that I would be excited to sit down and reread part or all of each and every one of these. And that's what makes them make this list. And so if there are series that you're like, but what about? Stay tuned first to see if they make the list of ones I still need to read, because there are plenty that I haven't read. Kingkiller Chronicles, I have not read yet, so I can't put it on this list. It may make the list afterwards. Once I encounter another series, maybe I'll decide to put Sanderson as just the Cosmere and get all of the Cosmere on there to free up a spot for one other series on here. But those are the 10. Hopefully you enjoyed hearing me just prattle on about it. It's fun to consider what would go on that ideal bookshelf. And then it is also fun because then I'm keeping my eye out for those things as I'm going through stores and looking for good copies to add to my shelf. And so once I get through this 100-book challenge, I know what fantasy series I'm going to be looking for, because I have the entire Narnia series. And I think I've got a couple of the Hobb books, 2 of which are really beat up from the Live Ship Traders. And I think I've got 1 of the Martin books. But beyond that, I don't have anything out of any of these series on my shelf, and that'll change for sure going forward. So thank you for watching. Hope you're having a great day.